Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 49 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Why did England want to establish colonies in North America? And how did Englishmen go about establishing those colonies? Today, we explore the early days of English colonization in North America with Malcolm Gaskill, author of Between Two Worlds: How the English Became American. During our exploration, Malcolm answers several questions, such as, how and when did Englishmen decide to establish colonies in North America? How did literature and colonization experiments in Ireland inform English colonization in North America? And how did the interconnectedness between England and her North American colonies inform the politics and culture of both England and her colonies? This is an interesting episode and one that offers a different vantage point from which to view England's colonization of North America. I hope you enjoy.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Today's guest is joining us from Cambridge, England, where he works as a professor of early modern history at the University of East Anglia. He has written numerous articles and book chapters, and he has authored 5 books, including Witchcraft, A Very Short History, and Between Two Worlds: How the English Became American. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Malcolm Gaskill.
Thank you very much, Liz. Good to be here.
Malcolm, let's dive right in. Let's talk about what drove you to write Between Two Worlds. Specifically, in the introduction, you mentioned that you wanted to explore a neglected dimension of colonial American and English history.
Well, I've done rather a strange thing for an academic historian, which I'm sort of working outside my comfort zone. So I'm basically a British historian of 17th century England. So, not a colonial American historian. I'm not exactly in that camp. But I was working on a book about witch trials in the middle of the 17th century in England. And, this is a moment of particular crisis where a lot of communities are dividing, and some people stay behind and have a civil war. Other people go over to America. So, I started to become curious after my work on the witch hunt about those people who had kind of left beforehand and crossed the Atlantic. But, from the British historical point of view, there's not that much interest in those who go over to America. So I had to start reading up on the colonial American stuff and then start to get a sense of, what was happening when those people arrived. So the neglected dimension really was kind of adding America or the American experience to my work on 17th century England. But then also the neglected dimension was kind of, adding to US American history a better sense of what was happening in England beyond that just being backstory to those people who'd arrived in America, and that was just their sort of, fuzzy memory of the old world.
Do you have a sense of why Americans and the colonists have kind of dwindled from English memory? Because here in America, we tend to remember our English history, and we're very proud of it.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think some of it has to do with, what happened after the loss of the colonies in the 18th century. So the English imperial history became more focused on India and Africa and what had happened in the 19th century. And so I think that, that memory of the early English colonists sort of faded away a bit, and, the empire came to mean something else. But, I think even reading American historiography that one gets a sense that, these colonists came from England, and although that there was this sort of proud memory of what had happened before, that, what really mattered when you arrived in America was America. Whereas, in fact, I think the story was more complex and nuanced than that. And those that arrived didn't kind of forget about old England, because often they went back and visited and wrote, and many of them actually just gave up being in America and then, migrated back the other way.
How and when did Englishmen decide to establish colonies in North America?
Well, you start seeing the first attempts towards the end of the 16th century. But, there's a mentality here that I think we need to understand, which is that England's at war with Spain in the 1580s, when I think this really starts to get going. And that the mentality is you need some kind of Atlantic basis from which to fight Spain, and also to get hold of gold and silver. So the early attempts at colonization have this kind of, smash and grab thinking behind them. And it's not what, we associate with the colonization of America into the 17th century. So you get, for example, one of the earliest colonies, which is in Roanoke Island, which is off present North Carolina. And this is led by, or organized by Sir Walter Raleigh. So it has a kind of a piratical kind of feeling behind it. Now, this colony is kind of badly organized, really. They no experience, they haven't thought it through. It only lasts about 3 years, and then all the colonies actually disappear. So this is an early failed attempt. So many colonial enterprises are failed attempts. But in the early part of the 17th century, peace is agreed with Spain, and that opens the way to a different kind of colony, a sort of permanent colony, which is focused a little bit more on plantation and permanent settlement rather than just some kind of military base from which to fight a foreign enemy.
I understand that England practiced colonization techniques on Ireland before they came to North America. Is that true? And if so, could you talk about the Irish colonization experiment?
Yeah, that's right. Ireland's a very important part of the story, I think, because, there's a bigger story here, which is about Elizabethan Conquest and the establishment of imperial authority. And so that, in that westward expansion, before you get to America from England, obviously you get to Ireland, a lot quicker. And that, what Elizabethan England is trying to impose in Ireland is obedience, but also to exploit the resources of that territory. So this is a military exercise, the conquest of Ireland, and again it has that very brutal feeling to it, because that's what that's the mentality. You have to subdue the native peoples before you can impose your own people there. So, those colonists in Ireland many of them are soldiers, and they build forts. But I think that this mentality of conquest, which of course the Spanish have done in America throughout the 16th century, ultimately evolves into something else. I think the realization gradually dawns on the English that really it's planting and permanent settlement which is going to be most successful and actually in the end most lucrative. But I think that many of those who go to early Virginia in the early part of the 17th century also have experience of conquest in Ireland, and so they take that kind of, as I say, rather uncompromising and often rather vicious mentality with them.
One of the aspects of Between Two Worlds that I found fascinating was just how slow English colonization was to get going. It seemed that many Englishmen were reluctant to settle in North America. So then you start to see a proliferation of literature talking about North America. Would you tell us about that literature and who's writing it?
Yeah, it's very important to remember that going to America seems like a very bad idea early on, because so many of those early colonization ventures fail. And, so often we forget about the ones that failed and we just sort of, remember the ones that succeeded, because, those states still exist today, and, this early history is just the genesis of those modern states. So English men, for colonists and also investors, needed quite a lot of persuading that going to America or putting money into America was actually a good idea. So, as you say, there are a lot of publications which appear, and that prominent amongst the authors of these was Captain John Smith. Now, John Smith is a soldier of fortune, again, one of these sort of men with a very military and often rather brutal mentality, but he does also have a certain sensitivity to the possibilities of colonization. I think he's more of a visionary. In 1608, he writes a letter home, which then gets published as a pamphlet called A True Relation of Virginia. And this is just the first of a number of works that he writes, and they kind of gather together in the 1620s as a general history of Virginia. And again, this isn't just about military conquest, although it has that edge to it. It's also about understanding the flora and the fauna and the peoples, the indigenous peoples of North America. And so it has a kind of anthropology behind it. And the Smith also coins the phrase, New England for the first time in 1614, and so starts to spread the idea of of a land across the Atlantic in which a new kind of improved version of England can be built, because of course England has its own social, economic, political problems, so there's quite a lot of rather idealistic, even utopian thinking about how England can be improved, in other territories.
Was the literature that Smith and others produced successful in getting Englishmen to settle or at least invest into the colonies?
Well, this is also an age of the production and consumption of print and of growing literacy. So, the readers are always looking for things to read about. And the story of what's happening in America is undeniably exciting. And I think we can see the fact that the Virginia Company, although in the end it does get taken over by the Crown and it has awful financial problems, it doesn't succeed in building a permanent colonial bridgehead in America. So I think by that measure, it is rather successful because, of course, investors, there's a certain kind of investor today and in early 17th century England who really likes a risk. And although the sort of thing that might put, you or I off, actually attracts a certain kind of person who thinks, well, I'm probably going to lose my shirt on this, but if I'm successful, we'll make an awful lot of money. And of course, those who actually go over are often very young people who think, well, I'll take my chances in America because there aren't really those, that many opportunities for me that exist in England at this time. So, I think it is successful because it spreads a kind of tantalizing hope that you might just be successful, even if actually all the evidence points to the contrary.
Let's explore the actual settlement of the colonies. In Between Two Worlds, Malcolm explores the origins of many different colonies: Virginia, Bermuda, Barbados, Massachusetts, Jamaica, Maryland, and that's just to name but a few of the colonies he covers in the book. Malcolm, all of these colonies had different beginnings, but it seems like the early colonists in each colony had similar experiences. Would you tell us about the common experiences of English colonists as they worked to settle new homes in these different colonies?
Yes, there are many common experiences, especially for those who arrive in places where there is already no settlement whatsoever. So the first problem is establishing a source of fresh water and shelter, and then also a little bit beyond that, a source of food, because they take supplies with them, but then those supplies are often quickly diminished. So really, water, shelter, and food are the most important things. So, for example, when Boston settled, when they settle across the river at Charleston, there are no good springs there, which is why they have to cross the river to get to Boston, because that's just where the better water is, or rather, what becomes Boston. So this is a real problem. And at Jamestown, they choose the site poorly because there is a confluence of the fresh water and salt water there, which means that the sewage flows back, which means everybody gets sick. So water is incredibly important at the start. But once they get those things sorted out, shelter, food, and water, they also have to impose structures of law and order and hierarchy of the sort with which they're familiar, because they have to impose their Englishness because they don't know anything else. So another thing that they have to try to get going is some kind of division of labour, because again, that's the sort of thing which makes English life successful. So you suddenly realise you have to have someone who makes barrels, who makes shoes, who makes clothes, who plants, who grows. You need to have a range of trades and occupations in order to make everything kind of fit together. Of course, another problem is local enemies. So, naturally, as these English colonists push against and into the territories of indigenous peoples, this creates inevitable ethnic conflict and warfare. There are, of course, other foreign powers, the Dutch and Swedish, French and so on, who are, pushing against English territory and vice versa. So there's conflict there too. There's even conflict with just the elements. There's often weather, particularly in the Caribbean, where there are earthquakes and tornadoes, which, completely wreck plantations, and they have to start all over again or just give up and go home. Problems also with vermin. There are flocks of pigeons come down of a size they've never seen before and eat all the grain and the seed that they've planted. And in some of the Caribbean islands, dreadful problems with rats that come and eat everything too. So there are all these problems that are of a type and of a scale that they've never encountered before, and all of them need to be overcome if the colonies to be successful.
In your response, you mentioned or alluded to the English relations with Native Americans. And I wonder if you could talk about perhaps there's a cultural reason why the English have such fraught relations with the Native Americans. And I'm not saying that every European colonist has great relations with Native Americans, but when you look at French colonization as a whole, they seem to strike a balance with Native Americans in New France. The Dutch are just particularly interested in trade. And yet you have the New English in New England fighting Native Americans. They do it in Virginia. It just seems very militaristic in their relations. Can you speak to that?
Well, the English are undeniably extremely aggressive. And, like I was saying about Ireland, is that they take with them a certain kind of feeling of entitlement to land, often based on biblical authority, where they feel that, this land is not being used in the way that God would have intended it to be, and therefore it is vacant, and therefore it's not just their right to move into this land, but actually it's their kind of religious duty to. Now, again, that sort of seems like a kind of special pleading to us, but I think that within the framework of their mentality, they really did believe it. But of course, that creates tremendous amounts of conflict because the land wasn't empty. It was just being used differently and understood differently by those who had actually had a greater right to it, the indigenous peoples of North America. So, there's a clash of cultures there, and a lot of that is a clash of understandings about what property is, or rather it's the assertion of the right to property over people who don't understand it property at all in the same way. So I think that is, a large part of the problem. The English, of course, in some areas they have much better relationships with Native Americans than others. And of course, the Native American nations and tribes are actually quite diverse. Some of them are much more peaceable than others. Some of them are much more accepting of the English. So you get quite a lot of local variation. But of course, that when you move into the 1670s, there you've got into a situation where it's absolutely catastrophic because so many rather diverse Native American tribes and nations come together to fight the English as a whole in New England, who also then come together. But that's really taken a couple of generations for things to get really quite that bad, I think.
We've discussed the similarities that all of these different colonists had. Let's look at their differences. Colonies such as Massachusetts and Bermuda had religious origins. Virginia and Jamaica clearly had economic origins. Would you discuss if and how religious and economic origins affected the development of these colonies?
Sure. I think that some of these differences can be exaggerated. There were usually a mixture of motives for founding a colony, and that certainly no religious colony could ever survive if it didn't also have economic ambition. So even, the sort of the most idealistic of the lot, the Pilgrim Fathers that go to New Plymouth in 1620 on the Mayflower, they have to raise money, they have to borrow money, they have financial backers, they have to grow things, they have to find exports, they have to pay off those who have paid for them to get there. So there is always I suppose what we would think of as a kind of capitalistic spirit amongst these people. But you're quite right that there are often dominant motives, and if you look at the way that the Caribbean sugar plantations were developed, well, in the Caribbean there's very little, sort of religious idealism whatsoever. But even if you go to places like in Massachusetts and you think about the foundation of Boston, these are founded essentially on ideals of religious freedom and of a kind of, a furthering of the Protestant Reformation, I suppose, in a way that would really show England how badly it's gone wrong and how good it can be. But you find that even in those places that are like Plymouth or Boston that are founded on religious idealism, very quickly those people disagree about what the right religious path is. And that's not just a colonial problem, that's because they're mirroring different strands of religious thinking which are happening in England as well. So it's a good example of the way that religious conflict in England and disagreement about really what the correct form of worship should be, they're also happening in the American colonies. So in terms of the way that the colonies develop, colonies tend to grow, and as they grow, bits split off them because people start to compete for resources, or they start to compete over what is the correct trajectory for that colony, be that economic or be it religious. So the colonies grow and then they split. And I think, that is a very familiar pattern.
One of the aspects of Between Two Worlds that I really enjoyed is how Malcolm explores the interconnectedness between England and her colonies. The colonists really pay attention to what is going on in England, and England pays attention to what is going on in her colonies. Malcolm, would you provide us with an example or two of this interconnectedness between Mother England and her children colonies?
Sure, yeah. Well, again, the people who go to America don't stop being English in any way at all. In fact, in some ways, they become almost there's almost an exaggerated form of English culture which they export. So one of the problems that colonists face, having talked about some of those material problems, are the emotional problems of homesickness and the fact that they've left family behind and that there are all sorts of things that they miss, from loved ones right down to, material things like beer and a warm fire in a nice home. These are all sort of things that people write letters about and become very sort of nostalgic. But probably the best example where you can see a really intense sort of interconnectedness between England and the colonies is in the period of the English Civil War in the 1640s. And there you get a kind of a problem, I suppose, for some of those colonists who have gone over to America, particularly those Puritan colonists who've gone over thinking that perhaps that when Christ returns to earth, it's going to be in America rather than England. Well, once the English Civil War starts, then a lot of those Puritan colonists think, well, actually, maybe this is going to happen in England after all, because they have this very profound and serious sense of biblical prophecy and of themselves being positioned on a timeline which will ultimately lead to Armageddon and lead to the millennium and lead to the moment when Christ returns to earth and leads his saints. So, of course, that though the Pilgrim Fathers consider themselves to be God's elect saints. So this is the way that they understand what's happening in the Civil War. So that the Civil War divides opinion in America. Those that think you should definitely go back and fight in England because this is where the battle's going to be played out. Others who think, well, we should hold on in America because, our experiment is not yet at an end. But you get, a tremendous number of sermons and pamphlets and letters and newspapers all crisscrossing the Atlantic, and people praying for England and England praying for America. And this is all, documented very fully. So you get this in very, very strong affinity at this time. But of course, in the slightly longer term, one of the things that comes to dominate is just this sense of being 3,000 miles from home. This inevitably shapes different cultures on both sides of the Atlantic, particularly as the English crown starts to, really irritate the colonists by treating them not like the English subjects which they know themselves to be.
You mentioned the English Civil Wars. That was a time of political instability in England. And during these times of political instability in England, the colonies really mirror that. I'm thinking specifically of the Glorious Revolution of 1688-89. You have Leisler's Rebellion, the overthrow of Andros in the Dominion of New England. I wonder, does England ever mirror the political instability of the colonies? And there's a lot of instabilities to go around in the colonies.
Sure. Well, in many ways, the mirroring is a kind of hall of mirrors. So rather than it just being a sort of a traffic going one way and the other, there's a circularity because so many of the people and the ideas are in constant motion. Sometimes with some of the, I suppose you'd call it the exceptionalist historiography of America, sort of presupposes that you only go one way and that when you get to America you start thinking and feeling very differently. But there's so much, sort of reciprocity between English culture and American culture because in a sense it's all English political and social culture. It's just that it's being played out on both sides of the Atlantic and in spaces in between. So that, the period of the English Civil War, and then, as you rightly say, into the period of the Glorious Revolution, these are particular moments when the ideas and the ideals of the political and religious future of Protestant England, but not just situated within the territory of England, are very, very much in ferment. So that in a sense, the Glorious Revolution, which breaks out in Boston, is triggered by the news of the Glorious Revolution that's broken out in England, but it doesn't become an American Glorious Revolution, even though it happens to be in Boston. It's still very much about the ideals of political and religious leadership for the English Protestant world, wherever that happens to be. So that so much of the current writing about 17th century America isn't just about England or America, it's about that Atlantic world and that dynamism that exists within it.
Earlier you mentioned that the colonists adopted almost an exaggerated form of Englishness. I wonder if you could tell us about how interactions with Native Americans and colonial Americans from other places like the Netherlands, Germany, France, Spain, all these other European nations that come to America, as well as enslaved Africans, challenged the English colonists' sense of Englishness.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, the challenges from other Europeans are not particularly great. I mean, into the 18th century, this becomes a much more international story, but the English do really dominate colonization in the 17th century, and I think that the other European cultures don't impinge as much as we might think. I mean, you might do some of the middle colonies an exception, and the way that, when New Amsterdam becomes New York, that really there is a certain kind of integration between English and Dutch culture, but essentially I don't think Englishness is threatened by other European cultures. I think it is much more threatened, particularly in frontier settlements by, the very early settlements by Native American culture, because the English go with a particular kind of arrogance that they can just impose their own economic system, they can impose their own religious ideas, they can impose their own forms of social hierarchy upon Native Americans because they believe fervently that their way of life is superior. But of course, nothing quite goes to plan, and that simply to survive in those early years, that the English have to make all sorts of compromises, and they have to learn from the way that the Native Americans live in that land. So they learn all sorts of things to do with clothing and about planting, to do with design of houses, and particularly once conflict starts, they learn even to fight like Native Americans. So, for example, by the time you get to the wars of the 1670s, then they are, starting to wear soft shoes like moccasins, because then you can creep up on your enemy. They're starting to use tomahawks and those sort of, so there is inevitably a kind of a trade-off, although that the English often feel uncomfortable because they feel that they should be imposing entirely their culture, but quite inevitably some of the way that the Native Americans live has to rub off on the English colonists as well.
Susan would like to know if the first colonists from Britain were more hardworking and ambitious than their peers who stayed home in England. And she'd also like to know what characteristics distinguish colonists from Britons in England.
Well, it's a very interesting question. Well, the writers of promotional literature trying to sell the colonies to English migrants and investors always have quite a lot to say about this, and that they try to sort of taunt those who are staying at home as being lazy and are being too sort of addicted to comfort and luxury. They say things like, you English people at home are sitting by your cosy fireside with your, bread and cheese and pot of beer, and, it's very hard for those people to actually, to get up off their backsides and actually do something adventurous. So the part of the taunting is actually saying, it's a failing of bravery. And back in the days of Drake and Raleigh in the 16th century, England had a kind of an intrepid crusading spirit, but now actually everyone's a bit sluggish and a bit complacent. And what you really need to do is to embrace this invitation and get yourselves on a ship to America. So there certainly is that perception, But again, that is coming from the writers of promotional literature who have a special interest in trying to incite those slightly kind of reticent would-be colonists in order to actually do something about it. Of course, there are many of those who go to America who do so rather reluctantly and actually fail, and a great number of those are indentured servants, so young, poor apprentices, particularly going to Virginia and to Maryland. And that, they are people who, as I say, they don't make a success of their lives in America. In fact, the mortality rate is incredibly high. And that those who actually run the colonies write home and say, please don't send any more of those kinds of apprentices, because all they do is eat our food and they're too lazy. So again, there are many who go in a kind of bondage to America, and they tend not to succeed. But the others, say, who go to Puritan New England, they tend to be of a different sort of stamp. And I think what really marks them out is not just that they are incredibly sort of far-sighted and imaginative, but they're also fantastically brave. And I think that, so much of what I write about in my book is the quality of courage, what the anatomy of courage is for these early colonists, and just how important it is to have that sort of vision and faith and self-belief and bravery in order just to get started, never mind to actually stick it out once you actually get there.
I'm glad you raised the topic of writing your book, because in the preface, Malcolm mentions that he adopted the perspective of English migrants when he wrote Between Two Worlds. Malcolm, why do you think adopting this perspective was important? And, how did you go about adopting it, and how did adopting this perspective influence the way you wrote your book?
Well, in a sense, it sort of wasn't too difficult because I didn't, having not been a colonial American historian, I didn't have a choice. I could only really write it, from an English perspective, not because I happened to be British myself, but because I was a historian of early modern England. So, one of the problems I had at the start was that, I had to read a massive literature, and I had to familiarise myself with American archives and indeed go to the States in order to do the primary source research. But part of the advantage of that was actually that my views of what had happened in that first century of colonization were not coloured by what happened later on. So I very explicitly was not writing a history which sort of traced the origins of the United States, more that it was to try to extend, what we understood about the experience of 17th century English people. I don't want to be too coy about that. Inevitably, I have written a book which is about early America, but it doesn't set out to look for origins. And I think just including the Caribbean, particularly in the story, is very important there, because these are often areas which, much of the Caribbean doesn't become the future United States, and therefore has tended to be left out a bit of colonial histories that, as I say, just sort of trace the histories of modern US states back to their early foundations. So, I wasn't trying to set out to write a book about the origins of the US. There is, of course, an element to that, but I do think that, having been a historian of early modern England and just extending the stories of English people into America does make that book, hopefully makes it distinctive.
As you were grappling with all this literature and doing your research, did you ever consider whether or not you would have had what it took? Like, if you were living in England during the 16th century, if you would have migrated?
Oh, yeah, many, many times. I think, all historians, have those kinds of flights of fancy. And, we live very comfortable lives in the West, and these are typically people who have lived, rather hard lives. Even people we might think of as relatively prosperous in their own time have a tremendous amount of fortitude, and I think it's very hard for us to understand that. These people just go hungry a lot of the time, and it's very hard for somebody who is well fed to understand what it's like to constantly face conditions of near starvation, and that's only one of the problems they face. So, yeah, I thought about it all the time, and of course, when you're sitting on a plane crossing the Atlantic and you feel you can't stand another hour of that 7-hour, 8-hour flight or whatever it is, I often thought, well, could be on a boat down there and spending, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 weeks on a boat, and how people put up with that is very hard to imagine.
Those are difficult questions because no matter how much we know about the past and try to understand it, there's always an aspect we'll never be able to understand because just some of their world will always be closed to us.
Sure.
Let's transition into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Malcolm, earlier you discussed John Smith and others who promoted the colonies through literature. In your opinion, what might have happened if Richard Hakluyt, John Smith, and other colonial promoters had not written about North America and the opportunities there? Do you think the Englishmen still would have launched colonization companies and projects? And how do you think the colonization of North America would have been different?
Yeah, it's a great fun question. I think it would still have happened. I think that many more colonists and adventurers would have learnt the hard way. I think that there was something in England at that time which was it was going to mean almost inevitably that they were going to be expanding. Of course, all European powers were looking overseas to some extent. But, already so many of those colonial enterprises were sort of leaps in the dark, and they weren't very well informed. And so I think that there just would have been a lot more of that. And as I say, that in some ways it's a little bit like the Industrial Revolution, where we kind of remember the inventions that succeeded, but we forget about all the many, 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 many failures, which were all still part of a spirit of endeavour and were built on hope. So I think that there would have been many more, but there just would have been a lot more disasters. And if we look at, say, for example, John Winthrop and the foundation of Massachusetts in the 1630s, those early pioneers of New England, they'd read John Smith. John Smith had done them, and other writers had done them a great service by writing about colonies that had succeeded and failed, and had written about the strategies and tactics which had succeeded and failed. So the thing that, for example, that John Winthrop really learnt from the experience of Jamestown was to make a colony succeed, you've got to plant families there. You've got to have you've got to have some sort of structure of regeneration in that colony and not just rely on taking shiploads of apprentices over. You've got to actually recreate those structures of the old world in the new world. Otherwise, it will never succeed. So there was always a learning curve. And as I say, I think that if those writers hadn't actually written what they'd written, they would have gone anywhere. They just would have made more mistakes.
Your scholarship has crossed the Atlantic to write between two worlds. Are you sticking around the North Atlantic in your next project, or are you moving back to England?
Well, I sort of feel in some ways that I never completely left England. I just, like so many of those colonists, just made a kind of excursion and stayed a while and then came back. But I am actually going back again. So at the moment I'm working on a case study which is about the town of Springfield, which is a frontier town in western Massachusetts, which, ticks all those boxes of early intrepid endeavour. So that this is man William Pynchon, who's an extraordinary pioneer who migrates from eastern Massachusetts to west to build a town completely from scratch, which is both infused with a spirit of godly idealism, but is also essentially about making money from the beaver trade. And what happens there in the 1650s is the tensions build up between neighbours, and they have a small witch craze. There's a small witch panic that breaks out, and that's what I'm working on at the moment.
Fantastic. And where is the best place to look for more information about you, your work, and how to get in contact with you?
Well, I have a website. It's www.malcolmgaskill, all one word, .net. So there's pretty much everything that anyone could want to know about me there, and there's an email address there. And I'm always very happy to receive emails from readers and listeners, and always try to reply.
Malcolm, thank you so much for helping us explore a more English aspect of North American colonization today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Liz. I've enjoyed it.
The written word carries great power, and as Malcolm revealed today, 17th century pamphlets, books, and journals about North America encouraged many Englishmen to take the plunge, to either invest in colonization or to start a new life in North America. Malcolm also observed that almost all of the English men and women who settled in North America settled as English men and women, but they wouldn't always remain English. They crossed the Atlantic Ocean with the idea that they could just recreate their old homes and culture in North America, but upon their arrival, they found that the climate and geography of the continent would not allow for exact recreations of their old English lives. So, they had to adapt their English-styled buildings, governments, and methods of agriculture to fit their new environment. How did they do this? They looked to the peoples around them, Native Americans, Africans, and other Europeans, and they borrowed pieces of their cultures that worked in this new place. So within a relatively brief period of time, all of the adaptations the English colonists made led to the development of an English-influenced but distinctly American culture and way of life. You can find more information about Malcolm, his book, Between Two Worlds, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode, benfranklinsworld.com/049. Do you love reading and talking about history? If so, you should join Poor Richard's Club, the social community for Ben Franklin's World listeners on Facebook. Membership is free, and to join, all you need to do is text BF World to 33444 or visit benfranklinsworld.com and sign up for the Franklin Gazette. And finally, next week marks a milestone for us. Episode 50! This episode needed a special figure, and as we've already talked about Washington, I picked the only person who can rival Washington with name recognition. Who do you think will be the topic for episode 50? Send your guesses to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet them to @LizCovart, or post your guess on the show notes page for this episode or in Poor Richard's Club.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.